In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, the midsummer flower show blooms with beauty and ambition, until a deadly poison claims the life of head judge Sir Henry Clithering. Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eye and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of secrets among 4 suspects: a prideful grower, a meticulous organizer, a desperate rival, and a mysterious botanist. As rivalries and grudges surface, only one question remains: who laced the teacup with a rare alkaloid? Join Miss Marple in a thrilling tale of betrayal, where ambition proves deadlier than any flower. Chapter 1. The Bloom of Ambition. The sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, where the village green had transformed into a canvas of vibrant anticipation. Tents, their white peaks sharp against the summer sky, stood in orderly rows, festooned with bunting in shades of primrose and scarlet. The midsummer flower show, an event as cherished as the church fete and twice as contentious, was in full preparation. From her cottage window, Miss Jane Marple, her eyes bright behind her spectacles, watched the scene unfold with the quiet curiosity of one who understood that beneath the surface of village pleasantries lay currents of rivalry and pride. Miss Marple's hands, delicate but sure, moved rhythmically with her knitting needles, the soft click a counterpoint to her thoughts. She had attended the flower show for decades, and each year it revealed more about human nature than about horticulture. The competitors were not merely vying for ribbons. They were staking claims to prestige, their blooms a mirror of their ambitions. This year, however, the air held a peculiar tension, as if the very dahlias and roses sensed a storm brewing. The arrival of Sir Henry Clithering, a retired Scotland Yard commissioner, and Miss Marple's occasional confidant, added weight to the occasion. His reputation for incisive judgment made him an ideal head judge, though not a universally beloved one. Miss Marple had received a letter from him only a week prior, written in his precise hand, expressing delight at returning to St. Mary Mead for the show. "A chance to escape London's clamor," he wrote, "though I suspect your village has its own dramas." She smiled at the recollection, knowing he was not wrong. As she strolled toward the green, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, Miss Marple observed the key players in this year's drama. Mr. Reginald Thorne, a grower whose greenhouse was the envy of the county, was arranging his dahlias with a meticulousness bordering on reverence. His tall frame stooped slightly, as if the weight of his reputation pressed upon him. Miss Marple noted his quick glances toward the crowd, searching perhaps for a rival's approach. Nearby, Mrs. Lavinia Price, the show's organizer, moved with the brisk efficiency of a general. Her clipboard was ever present, her pencil ticking off tasks with military precision. Yet her smile, as she greeted villagers, seemed, to Miss Marple, a touch too tight, as if the strain of perfection was wearing thin. Mrs. Price's auburn hair, pinned neatly under a straw hat, gleamed in the sunlight, but her eyes darted with a restlessness that spoke of more than organizational woes. Mr. Cedric Hawthorne, a grower whose hybrid roses had stirred whispers of genius, stood by his display with a proprietary air. His broad shoulders and florid complexion suggested a man of vigor, but his scowl as he watched Sir Henry inspect a neighboring exhibit hinted at a temper. Miss Marple recalled village gossip. Hawthorne had lost the championship last year to Thorne, a defeat he attributed to Sir Henry's unfair scrutiny. His ambition, she mused, was as thorny as his roses. The final figure to catch her eye was Miss Eleanor Vance, a newcomer to Saint Mary Mead. Slender and pale, with an air of quiet intensity, she moved through the crowd like a shadow. Introduced as a botanist visiting from London, she lingered near the judge's table, her dark eyes taking in every detail. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the unusual, wondered why a woman of such apparent sophistication would attend a village flower show. There was something in Miss Vance's manner, a stillness, a watchfulness, that set her apart. As the tents filled with villagers and competitors, Miss Marple settled onto a bench, her knitting bag at her side. She exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Bantry, who bustled over with tales of her own garden's failures. "Dolly," Miss Marple said softly, "do you notice how Mr. Thorne avoids Mr. Hawthorne's gaze, and how Mrs. Price seems to stiffen when Miss Vance passes by?" Mrs. Bantry, accustomed to her friend's insights, chuckled. "Jane, you'll find a mystery in a bed of petunias." But Miss Marple's smile was faint. The flower show, with its perfumes and rivalries, was a stage for human passions, and where there was passion, she knew, there was often peril. As Sir Henry's voice boomed across the green, welcoming the crowd to the show, Miss Marple's needles paused. She felt, with the certainty of long experience, that this year's blooms would be overshadowed by something far darker. Chapter 2. A Thorn Among Roses. The midsummer flower show dawned with a brilliance that seemed to mock the quiet tensions simmering beneath St. Mary Mead's idyllic surface. The village green, transformed into a vibrant mosaic, hummed with the energy of anticipation. Canvas tents, their peaks sharp against a cerulean sky, stood in neat rows, adorned with bunting in shades of primrose, scarlet, and soft lavender. The air was heavy with the mingled perfumes of roses, lilies, and freshly mown grass, underscored by the murmur of villagers in their Sunday finery, their voices bright with excitement or hushed with gossip. Miss Jane Marple, her gray shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, moved through the crowd with the unassuming grace of a sparrow, her sharp eyes missing nothing. To her, the flower show was not merely a display of horticultural prowess, but a stage where human passions, pride, envy, ambition, played out in intricate patterns. Her hands, delicate yet steady, rested lightly on her knitting bag as she paused near a display of sweet peas, their pastel petals trembling in the breeze. She had attended this event for decades, each year noting how the blooms reflected their growers' characters, bold, delicate, or deceptive. This morning, however, the air carried a weight beyond the usual rivalries, as if the very flowers sensed a storm brewing. Miss Marple's gaze swept the green, cataloging the figures who would, she suspected, shape the drama to come. The festivities began with a flourish of trumpets, a touch of grandeur insisted upon by Mrs. Lavinia Price, the show's organizer, despite murmurs about the cost. Mrs. Price, a woman of formidable efficiency, stood near the platform, her auburn hair pinned tightly beneath a straw hat, her clipboard a scepter of authority. Her eyes, bright but strained, darted across the scene, ensuring every detail, from the alignment of chairs to the polish on the tea service, was flawless. Miss Marple, who had known Mrs. Price since her days as a young schoolteacher, noted the faint tremor in her hands as she ticked off tasks. The burden of perfection, she thought, was a heavy one, and Mrs. Price wore it like a corset, tight and unyielding. On the platform, Sir Henry Clithering, the head judge, prepared to address the crowd. His silver hair gleamed in the sunlight, his posture erect with the quiet authority of his Scotland Yard years. Miss Marple, who had corresponded with him since their first meeting at a London dinner party, admired his blend of charm and incisiveness. His letter, received only a week prior, had hinted at his pleasure in returning to St. Mary Mead. "A respite from London's clamour," he wrote, "though I wager your village has its own intrigues." Now, as he raised a hand for silence, his voice carried across the green. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it is my honor to open the Midsummer Flower Show, a celebration of beauty, dedication, and the spirit of competition. May your blooms inspire us all." The applause was warm, though Miss Marple noted a few restrained claps, particularly from Mr. Cedric Hawthorne, whose arms remained crossed, his jaw tight with barely concealed resentment. She settled onto a folding chair near a display of chrysanthemums, their golden heads nodding in the breeze, and turned her attention to the key players. Mr. Reginald Thorne, a grower whose greenhouse was a local legend, was arranging his dahlias with the precision of a watchmaker. His tall frame, slightly stooped from years bent over soil, moved with care as he adjusted a crimson bloom, its petals glowing like embers. Yet his eyes, pale and restless, scanned the crowd as if searching for a threat. Miss Marple knew his history. A man whose skill had earned him accolades, but whose pride had been stung by past critiques, particularly from Sir Henry. A decade ago, Sir Henry's review had cost Thorne a lucrative contract, a slight still whispered about in the village. Was that old wound, she wondered, still festering? Nearby, Mr. Hawthorne stood by his hybrid roses, their blush-pink petals drawing gasps from passers-by. His broad shoulders and florid complexion suggested vigor, but his scowl as Sir Henry passed by betrayed a deeper discontent. Last year's flower show, where Thorne's dahlias had triumphed over Hawthorne's roses, had been a public humiliation, blamed squarely on Sir Henry's unfair judgment. Hawthorne's ambition was palpable, his roses a testament to his drive to outshine his rival. Miss Marple noted how he greeted admirers with a grin, but his eyes followed Sir Henry with a cold intensity that spoke of more than professional rivalry. Miss Eleanor Vance, the mysterious guest, was harder to read. Slender and pale, her dark dress a stark contrast to the bright colors around her, she moved through the tents with the quiet purpose of a spectre. Introduced as a botanist from London, she carried a small notebook, her pencil scratching observations as she studied the displays. Her dark eyes, sharp and unyielding, lingered on the judge's table, where Sir Henry and his colleagues conferred. Miss Marple, ever alert to the unusual, wondered what drew a woman of such apparent sophistication to a village event. There was a stillness to Miss Vance, a watchfulness that suggested hidden depths, or hidden motives. Mrs. Price, meanwhile, darted between tasks, her clipboard a constant companion. She paused to adjust a floral arrangement, her fingers lingering on the petals as if to steady herself. Miss Marple, seated now with Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had bustled over with tales of her own garden's failures, observed Mrs. Price's interactions. "She's wound tighter than a clock spring," Mrs. Bantry remarked, fanning herself with a program. "Lavinia takes this show far too seriously." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "She does, Dolly, but control is a fragile thing. One slip, and it unravels." As the morning gave way to afternoon, the judging began in earnest. Sir Henry, joined by two local horticulturists, Miss Amelia Hart, a spinster with a passion for orchids, and Mr. George Ellis, a retired banker with a penchant for peonies, moved from display to display, their notebooks filling with comments. The competitors hovered nearby, their expressions a study in contrasts. Thorne's anxious deference, Hawthorne's forced nonchalance, Mrs. Price's vigilant oversight, and Miss Vance's detached observation. Miss Marple watched as Sir Henry paused at Thorne's dahlias, his pen poised. "Remarkable color," he said, his voice carrying, though the symmetry could be refined. Thorne's face tightened, but he nodded, his hands clasped behind his back. Mrs. Bantry whispered, "Poor Reginald. He lives for those flowers." A word from Sir Henry could break his heart. At Hawthorne's table, the mood was sharper. Sir Henry's comment, "Innovative hybridization, but consistency is key," drew a curt nod from Hawthorne, whose eyes narrowed. Miss Marple recalled village gossip. Hawthorne's roses, the product of years of experimentation, were his ticket to a deal with a major nursery. A win today could secure his financial future. A loss, particularly to Thorne, could ruin him. His resentment of Sir Henry was no secret, and Miss Marple wondered how far that resentment might extend. Mrs. Price, ever present, ensured the judges' comfort, refilling their teacups from a silver service on the table. Miss Vance lingered nearby, her notebook open but her attention on Sir Henry. Miss Marple's needles paused as she noted a curious moment. Hawthorne, with a sudden burst of geniality, approached the table, offering to refresh Sir Henry's tea. "Yours has gone cold, sir," he said, his tone hearty, but his movements swift as he poured a fresh cup from the pot. Sir Henry, engrossed in his notes, accepted with a distracted nod. Mrs. Price, standing nearby, frowned slightly, her lips parting as if to speak, but she turned away. Miss Vance's eyes followed the exchange, her pencil still. The preliminary awards ceremony began at 3 o'clock, the crowd gathering under the main tent. Sir Henry took the platform, his presence commanding as he prepared to announce the early category winners. The judges' table, set with a white cloth and the gleaming tea service, stood to his right, a symbol of order amidst the fervor. Miss Marple, seated near the back, watched the suspects. Thorne, adjusting his tie nervously. Mrs. Price, clutching her clipboard. Hawthorne, arms crossed but eyes alert, and Miss Vance, half hidden in the tent's shadow, her notebook tucked away. Sir Henry's speech was gracious, praising the competitor's skill. "Mr. Thorne's dahlias show exceptional promise," he said, prompting a murmur of approval. "And Mr. Hawthorne's roses are a bold step forward, though not without flaws." The crowd shifted, sensing the undercurrent of rivalry. Hawthorne's face reddened, but he clapped along with the others, his smile tight. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind cataloging every gesture, every glance. Then, without warning, Sir Henry faltered. His hand went to his throat, his face contorting in a grimace of pain. The teacup slipped from his grasp, shattering on the platform with a sound like breaking glass. The crowd gasped as he staggered, his knees buckling, and collapsed, his body crumpling like a marionette with cut strings. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm, her voice a whisper. "Jane, what's happened?" Before Miss Marple could respond, Dr. Haydock, the village doctor, pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Sir Henry, his fingers searching for a pulse. After a tense moment, he looked up, his face ashen. "He's dead," he said, "and I suspect poison." The tent erupted in chaos. Villagers surged forward, their voices a cacophony of shock and fear. Mrs. Price dropped her clipboard, her hands trembling as she called for calm, her authority crumbling. Thorne stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief, his hands clutching a dahlia as if it could anchor him. Hawthorne backed away, his earlier confidence replaced by a pallor that matched the tense canvas. Miss Vance, alone among them, slipped toward the tent's edge, her movements swift and silent. Miss Marple, her heart heavy with the loss of her friend, watched them all, her mind already sifting through the fragments of the scene. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, his young face set with determination. He cordoned off the platform, securing the broken teacup and its contents for analysis. Sir Henry's body was gently covered with a blanket, and the crowd was ushered outside, their chatter now subdued. Craddock approached Miss Marple, who had remained seated, her knitting untouched. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone respectful but brisk, "Sir Henry spoke highly of your insight. If you'd share your observations, I'd be grateful." She inclined her head, her expression serene, but her mind racing. "It's far too early to say, Inspector," she replied. "But I noticed a few things." Mr. Hawthorne handled Sir Henry's tea, which is curious given his history with the judge. Mrs. Price was near the table, overseeing the service, and Miss Vance was watching closely. Mr. Thorne's knowledge of plants is extensive. Some might be dangerous in the wrong hands. Craddock nodded, jotting notes. "Poison," he said, "is a nasty business. We'll know more once the lab results come in." As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the judge's table. The tea service, now under police guard, seemed innocuous, yet it held the key to Sir Henry's death. She recalled a conversation with him years ago when he'd spoken of poison as a weapon of precision, requiring both opportunity and intent. Who among these four had both? Thorne, with his rare plants and old grudge, Mrs. Price, with her access to the tea and her need for control, Hawthorne, with his burning ambition and resentment, or Miss Vance, whose quiet presence hid unknown motives. Mrs. Bantry, still shaken, joined her, her fan fluttering. "Jane, it's dreadful. Sir Henry, of all people, who could do such a thing?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. "Someone who felt they had much to gain, Dolly," she said softly. "Or perhaps much to lose. People are like flowers. They thrive on care, but rivalry can make them deadly." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the green, Miss Marple walked home, her mind a tapestry of impressions. The flower show, meant to celebrate beauty, had become a stage for murder. She would need to tread carefully, for the truth, like a rare bloom, would require patience to uncover. But uncover it she would, for Sir Henry's sake, and for the quiet village she called home. Chapter 3. The Scent of Suspicion. The morning after Sir Henry Clithering's death cast a pall over St. Mary Mead, the village green now quiet where yesterday it had buzzed with life. The tents stood forlorn, their bunting sagging in the faint mist that clung to the grass. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her cottage window, sipped her morning tea, her knitting untouched on the table. Her eyes, sharp and thoughtful, gazed beyond the glass, piecing together the fragments of yesterday's tragedy. The flower show, meant to be a celebration, had become a stage for murder, and the scent of suspicion hung as heavy as the mist outside. Inspector Craddock arrived early, his police car crunching up the gravel path to the village hall, now repurposed as a temporary headquarters. His face, youthful but lined with determination, betrayed the weight of the case. Sir Henry's death was no mere village scandal. It was a challenge to his authority, and he meant to meet it head-on. Miss Marple, invited to the hall at Craddock's request, arrived promptly, her black handbag clutched like a talisman. Sir Henry had often praised her insight, and Craddock, though skeptical of her methods, knew better than to dismiss her. The hall was a hive of quiet activity, constables sorting statements and evidence bags. The broken teacup, its fragments sealed in plastic, sat on a table, a mute witness to the crime. Craddock greeted Miss Marple with a nod, his notebook already open. "The lab's working on the cup," he said, "but early tests suggest a fast-acting poison, likely an alkaloid, not something you'd find in a common garden." He outlined the suspects, his tone methodical. Mr. Reginald Thorne, whose greenhouse held rare plants; Mrs. Lavinia Price, who controlled the show's logistics; Mr. Cedric Hawthorne, whose grudge against Sir Henry was well known; and Miss Eleanor Vance, the botanist whose motives remained opaque. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind sifting through the details. "Poison," she said softly, "is a weapon of calculation. It requires knowledge, access, and a reason strong enough to risk everything." Craddock raised an eyebrow, accustomed to her cryptic observations. "Any thoughts on who had all three?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Not yet, Inspector, but people reveal themselves in small ways, gestures, glances, things unsaid. We must watch and listen." Her first stop was the village post office, where gossip flowed as freely as the stamps. Mrs. Margeau, the postmistress, was eager to talk, her eyes wide with the thrill of tragedy. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, leaning over the counter. "Sir Henry, poisoned at our show. I saw Mr. Thorne near the judge's table, you know, fussing with his flowers. And that Miss Vance, she was scribbling in her notebook like she was planning something." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging the flow of information. "And Mrs. Price?" she prompted. Mrs. Margeau sniffed. "Oh, she was everywhere, checking the tea, the cups, everything. Too perfect, if you ask me." Miss Marple left the post office, her mind turning over the snippets. Thorne's proximity to the table was notable, but so was Mrs. Price's oversight of the refreshments. Miss Vance's notebook intrigued her. Could it hold more than botanical notes? And Hawthorne, with his bold gesture of offering tea, remained a puzzle. She decided to visit each suspect, not to accuse, but to observe. For as she often told her nephew Raymond, it was in the ordinary moments that truth slipped through. Her first call was to Mrs. Price's cottage, a neat affair with roses climbing the walls. Mrs. Price answered the door, her auburn hair slightly disheveled, her smile strained. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, ushering her inside. The sitting room was immaculate, every cushion aligned, but a faint tremor in Mrs. Price's hands betrayed her nerves. "I can't believe it," she said, pouring tea with excessive care. "Sir Henry was so kind, so fair. I checked the tea service myself. Nothing was wrong." Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the herbal tonic on a shelf, its label faded. "You must be exhausted, Mrs. Price," she said gently. "Such responsibility, organizing the show. Did Sir Henry's rules ever complicate things?" Mrs. Price's lips tightened. "He was particular," she admitted. "Insisted on new judging protocols this year. It made my job harder, but I managed." Her voice held a note of resentment, quickly masked. Miss Marple made a mental note. Mrs. Price's need for control clashed with Sir Henry's authority. Could that friction have turned deadly? The tonic bottle, innocuous though it seemed, lingered in her thoughts. Next, she visited Mr. Thorne at his greenhouse, a glass cathedral filled with the hum of life. He was tending his dahlias, his hands steady but his eyes wary. "Miss Marple," he said, wiping soil from his fingers, "I suppose you're here about Sir Henry." She nodded, her expression mild. "A terrible loss. You were near the judge's table, I believe?" Thorne flushed. "Only to adjust my display. Sir Henry admired my South American dahlia. It's rare, you know." He gestured to a plant with vivid blooms, its leaves glossy. "Toxic sap, mind you, but I keep it locked away." He pointed to a cabinet, its key dangling from his belt. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the lock. Thorne's knowledge was vast, but his defensiveness suggested fear or guilt. Mr. Hawthorne was less welcoming. She found him at the village pub, nursing a pint, his florid face set in a scowl. "What do you want, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone brusque. She smiled, undeterred. "Just a chat about the show. Your roses were splendid." His scowl softened, but only slightly. "Should have won last year, but Sir Henry had it in for me. Biased he was." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And this year?" "With Sir Henry gone." Hawthorne's eyes flickered. "I'll win fair and square," he said, but his bravado rang hollow. She recalled his gesture with the tea, so gallant yet so convenient. His greenhouse, she knew, held unusual fertilizers. Could they conceal something more sinister? Miss Vance proved elusive, but Miss Marple tracked her to the village inn, where she was staying under a name that raised eyebrows, Miss E. Vane. The inn's parlor was dim, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood. Miss Vance sat by a window, her notebook open, her dark eyes meeting Miss Marple's with cool appraisal. "You're curious about me," she said, her voice low. "I'm a botanist, here to study local flora." Miss Marple smiled. "And Sir Henry? Did you know him?" Miss Vance's fingers tightened on her pencil. "We met at a conference. He dismissed my work, called it frivolous." The slight, though old, carried weight. Miss Marple noted the vial in Miss Vance's bag, glimpsed as she adjusted her shawl. A botanist's tool. Or something else? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bantry, who arrived with a basket of scones and a flood of questions. "Jane, it's like a novel. Poison at a flower show. Who do you think did it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind weaving connections. "Each has a reason, Dolly," she said. "Thorne's pride was wounded long ago. Mrs. Price chafed under Sir Henry's rules. Hawthorne's ambition burns bright, and Miss Vance, she hides something, I'm sure." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "But the poison, where did it come from?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "That, my dear, is the key, and I suspect it's closer than we think." As dusk fell, Miss Marple reflected on the day. The suspects were like flowers in a garden, each with their own beauty and thorns. Poison required opportunity, and all four had been near the fatal teacup. But motive, that was the root of it. She would need to dig deeper, for St. Mary Mead's secrets, like its roses, bloomed in unexpected ways. Chapter 4. The Grower's Secret. The morning mist had lifted from St. Mary Mead, leaving the village green bathed in a pale sunlight that did little to warm the chill of suspicion lingering from Sir Henry Clithering's death. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped over her shoulders, walked purposefully along the lane toward Mr. Reginald Thorne's greenhouse, her sensible shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the cobblestones. Her mind, as ever, was a quiet whirl of observations, sifting through the fragments of the flower show's tragedy. The poison that felled Sir Henry was no accident, and Mr. Thorne, with his vast knowledge of plants, was a thread in the tapestry she was determined to unravel. The greenhouse loomed ahead, its glass panes glinting like a jewel in the morning light. It was a structure of both beauty and precision, its iron framework housing rows of blooms that seemed to defy nature's limits. Miss Marple paused at the entrance, noting the faint scent of earth and something sharper, perhaps a chemical, perhaps a warning. Mr. Thorne was inside, his tall, stooped figure bent over a tray of seedlings, his hands moving with the care of a surgeon. He looked up as she entered, his pale eyes flickering with unease. "Miss Marple," he said, setting down a trowel, "I didn't expect you." "I hope I'm not intruding," she replied, her voice gentle, but her gaze keen. "Your dahlias were the talk of the show. I thought I'd see where such wonders are born." Thorne's face softened at the compliment, but the tension in his shoulders remained. He gestured to the rows of plants, their colors vivid against the glass. "This is my life's work," he said. "Every bloom, every leaf, it's all I have." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to a corner where a cluster of exotic plants stood apart, their leaves glossy and unfamiliar. "These are remarkable," she said, stepping closer. "From South America, I believe you mentioned?" Thorne's hand twitched, as if resisting an urge to steer her away. "Yes," he said, his voice tight. "A rare species. Their sap is potent. I keep them locked away." He pointed to a sturdy cabinet, its brass lock gleaming, a key dangling from a chain at his waist. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the key, noting its intricate design. "A wise precaution," she said. "Such plants could be dangerous in the wrong hands." Thorne's flush deepened, and he turned back to his seedlings, his fingers trembling slightly. "I'd never misuse them," he said. Sir Henry knew that. He admired them even. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. "He spoke highly of your work, didn't he? Though I recall he once criticized your methods. Years ago, wasn't it?" Thorne's jaw tightened, and he busied himself with a watering can. "That was a misunderstanding," he said. "Sir Henry's review cost me a contract, but I've moved past it. He was fair, in his way." The words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of bitterness, like a weed hidden among roses. She made a mental note. Thorne's pride was a fragile thing, and old wounds could fester. As she wandered the greenhouse, her eyes scanned the shelves, noting jars of fertilizer, pruning shears, and a stack of leather-bound journals. "Your records must be meticulous," she said, pausing by the journals. Thorne nodded, his gaze wary. "I track every planting, every hybrid. It's the only way to perfect the craft." Miss Marple smiled, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Could those journals hold more than horticultural notes? A recipe for poison, perhaps. She didn't ask. Thorne's defensiveness was answer enough for now. Leaving the greenhouse, she reflected on Thorne's demeanor. His love for his plants was genuine, almost reverent, but his nervousness suggested a man with something to hide. The locked cabinet intrigued her. Its contents were too dangerous to be dismissed. Yet poisoning Sir Henry required more than access to a toxic plant. It required intent, and Thorne's motive seemed rooted in a past slight rather than a present gain. Still, his proximity to the judge's table during the show, adjusting his display, placed him uncomfortably close to the fatal teacup. Her next stop was the village hall, where Inspector Craddock was reviewing statements with his constables. The air was thick with the scent of ink and damp wood, the hall's windows fogged from the morning's chill. Craddock greeted her with a nod, his notebook bristling with papers. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've confirmed the poison was an alkaloid, likely from a rare plant, not something you'd stumble across in a hedgerow." He gestured to a map of the show's layout, the judge's table marked in red. Thorne was seen near the table, as was Mrs. Price. Hawthorne poured the tea, and Miss Vance was lingering nearby. Any of them could have done it? Miss Marple studied the map, her fingers tracing the table's position. "Opportunity is one thing," she said, "but motive is another. Mr. Thorne's greenhouse is a treasure trove, but is he the sort to turn his passion into a weapon?" Craddock frowned. "He's got the knowledge, and that old grudge with Sir Henry, maybe it never healed." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps, but grudges are like seeds. They need the right conditions to grow into something deadly." She returned to her cottage, where Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her face alight with curiosity. "Jane, what did you find? Is Thorne the villain?" Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her needles resuming their familiar rhythm. "He's a man of pride, Dolly, and pride can be a dangerous thing. But I wonder if his heart lies more in his flowers than in revenge." She paused, her mind turning to the other suspects. Mrs. Price's control, Hawthorne's ambition, Vance's secrecy, each held a piece of the puzzle. The locked cabinet, the journals, the nervous glances, they were clues, but not yet answers. As the afternoon sun slanted through her window, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts as precise as her stitches. Thorne was a man of secrets, but whether those secrets included murder remained to be seen. The truth, she knew, was like a rare bloom. It required patience, care, and a willingness to look beneath the surface. She would visit Mrs. Price next, for the organizer's strained smiles and trembling hands hinted at a story yet untold. Chapter 5. The Organizer's Burden. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, gilding the cobblestone paths and softening the stark memory of Sir Henry Clithering's death. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, walked toward Mrs. Lavinia Price's cottage, her mind as alert as her steps were measured. The village, though outwardly calm, hummed with whispers of the flower show's tragedy, and Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Price, the event's meticulous organizer, held a key to the puzzle. Her control over the show's logistics, particularly the tea service, made her a figure of interest, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover what lay beneath her polished exterior. Mrs. Price's cottage was a study in order, its whitewashed walls framed by climbing roses that bloomed with almost unnatural precision. The front garden was immaculate, each flower bed a testament to discipline, as if chaos had been banished by sheer will. Miss Marple knocked, her knuckles light but firm, and the door opened to reveal Mrs. Price, her auburn hair pinned neatly, but her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice a blend of surprise and courtesy, "do come in. I'm afraid I'm rather at sixes and sevens today." The sitting room was as orderly as the garden, with lace doilies on every surface and a clock ticking with metronomic precision. A faint scent of lavender lingered, undercut by something medicinal, perhaps from the bottle of herbal tonic Miss Marple had noted on her last visit. Mrs. Price gestured to a chintz-covered chair, her hands betraying a slight tremor as she poured tea from a porcelain pot. "It's been dreadful," she said, her smile tight. "Sir Henry's death, such a shock, and to think it happened at my show." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes gentle but searching. "You managed the event splendidly, Mrs. Price. It must be a great responsibility, ensuring every detail is perfect." Mrs. Price's shoulders straightened, a flicker of pride breaking through her strain. "I do my best," she said. "The show is the village's pride, and I won't have it fall short." Sir Henry understood that, though his new rules made things challenging. Her voice held a note of irritation, quickly masked as she offered a biscuit. "Rules can be trying," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "I suppose Sir Henry's standards were quite exacting?" Mrs. Price's lips thinned. "He insisted on stricter judging criteria this year, more paperwork, more inspections. It made me look inefficient, as if I couldn't manage without his oversight." The words spilled out, and she caught herself, smoothing her skirt. "Not that I resented him, of course. He was only doing his duty." Miss Marple nodded, noting the defensiveness, the way Mrs. Price's fingers tightened around her teacup. Resentment, she thought, could be a slow poison, as deadly as any alkaloid. Her eyes drifted to the herbal tonic on the shelf, its label worn but legible, a remedy for nerves, common enough in a village pharmacy. "You must need that tonic with all the strain," Miss Marple said lightly. Mrs. Price flushed. "Oh, it's nothing, just a little help to keep calm. I've used it for years." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was elsewhere. The tonic seemed harmless, but its presence in a house so closely tied to the fatal tea service was worth noting. Could it conceal something more sinister, or was Mrs. Price's anxiety merely the burden of her role? As they chatted, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the show's logistics. "You oversaw the tea service, I believe?" she asked. Mrs. Price nodded, her composure returning. "I checked everything myself, the pot, the cups, the sugar. Nothing was amiss. I even tasted the tea beforehand, as I always do." Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance toward the window, as if she feared being overheard. "And Mr. Hawthorne's offer to pour Sir Henry's tea?" Miss Marple pressed gently. Mrs. Price's brow furrowed. "It was unusual. He's not one for courtesies. I thought it odd, but Sir Henry accepted, so I said nothing." Miss Marple made a mental note of this, recalling Hawthorne's bold gesture at the judge's table. Mrs. Price's access to the tea service gave her opportunity, but her motive, frustration with Sir Henry's rules, seemed bureaucratic rather than murderous. Yet her strained demeanor suggested a woman under pressure, and pressure, Miss Marple knew, could crack even the most orderly facade. She rose to leave, thanking Mrs. Price for her hospitality. "You've done the village proud," she said, her smile warm, but her eyes lingering on the tonic bottle one last time. Her next stop was the village hall, where Inspector Craddock was poring over reports. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and ink, and a constable guarded a table laden with evidence bags. Craddock looked up, his face weary but alert. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've had the tonic from Mrs. Price's house tested. Nothing but chamomile and valerian. No trace of the alkaloid." He gestured to a photograph of the broken teacup. "The poison was in the tea, no doubt about it. Whoever did this acted quickly, in plain sight." Miss Marple studied the photograph, her fingers tracing the air as if reconstructing the scene. Mrs. Price was diligent, she said, but diligence can blind one to what's happening nearby. Someone took advantage of that. Craddock nodded, flipping through his notebook. Thorne's greenhouse is our next focus, that South American plant of his. The sap matches the poison's profile, but he swears it's locked away. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Locks can be opened, Inspector, and motives can be hidden. Mrs. Price's burden is control, but control can mask deeper feelings. Craddock raised an eyebrow. You think she's hiding something? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. I think everyone is hiding something, Inspector. The trick is finding what matters. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking as she reflected. Mrs. Bantry arrived, her face alight with curiosity. Jane, what's the news? Is Mrs. Price a fiend in disguise? Miss Marple chuckled softly. Not a fiend, Dolly, but a woman stretched thin. Her resentment of Sir Henry was real, but was it enough to kill? I'm not certain. She paused, her needles still. The tea service was her domain, yet someone else poured the fatal cup. We must look at Mr. Hawthorne next. His ambition is a fire that burns brightly. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gazed out her window, the village now cloaked in shadow. Mrs. Price's orderly world had been shaken, but whether by guilt or mere circumstance remained unclear. The truth, like a carefully tended garden, required patience to reveal its secrets. Miss Marple knew she must tread carefully, for the next step, Mr. Hawthorne's fiery ambition, might bring her closer to the heart of the crime. Chapter 6. The Rival's Ambition. The late afternoon light filtered through the elms of St. Mary Mead, casting dappled shadows on the village's quiet lanes as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the Rusty Plough, the local pub where Mr. Cedric Hawthorne was known to hold court. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of hay from nearby fields, but the weight of Sir Henry Clithering's murder pressed heavily on her thoughts. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a familiar companion as she pieced together the puzzle of the flower show's tragedy. Mr. Hawthorne, with his bold roses and bolder grudge, was a figure of fire in this quiet drama, and Miss Marple intended to test the heat of his ambition. The Rusty Plough was a low-beamed establishment, its interior dim and smoky, filled with the murmur of villagers seeking respite from the day's unease. Mr. Hawthorne sat at a corner table, his broad frame hunched over a pint of ale, his florid face set in a scowl that seemed to ward off company. His tweed jacket, worn but well-tailored, spoke of a man who cared for appearances, yet his eyes, red-rimmed and restless, betrayed a deeper disquiet. Miss Marple approached with her usual unassuming grace, her smile as disarming as a spring breeze. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, settling into a chair opposite him, "I hope I'm not disturbing you. Your roses were quite the spectacle at the show." Hawthorne's scowl softened, though his guard remained up. "They're the best I've ever grown," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with pride. "Should have taken the prize last year, but Sir Henry had other ideas." The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable, and Miss Marple noted how his fingers tightened around his glass, the knuckles whitening. "It must be disheartening," she said gently, "to feel your work was overlooked. Sir Henry's standards were high, weren't they?" "High?" Hawthorne snorted, taking a swig of ale. "Biased, more like. He favored Thorne's dahlias, always did. Cost me the championship and a deal with a London nursery. This year my roses were set to win. Would have secured me a contract worth thousands." His eyes gleamed, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something else. Desperation, perhaps, or fear. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. And now, with Sir Henry gone, the judging might be less rigorous? Hawthorne's gaze sharpened, as if sensing a trap, but he masked it with a laugh. "I'll win fair and square, Miss Marple. No need for tricks." Yet his bravado rang hollow, and Miss Marple recalled his gesture at the flower show, pouring Sir Henry's tea with a flourish that had seemed gallant, but now felt calculated. "You were kind to refresh Sir Henry's cup," she said, her tone conversational. "Not many would think to do so in the midst of such a busy event." Hawthorne's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his fingers drumming on the table. "It was nothing," he muttered. "Just being polite." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles, but she pressed no further. Instead, she steered the conversation to his greenhouse, a topic she knew would loosen his tongue. "Your roses are remarkable," she said. "Such hybrids must require special care. Fertilizers, perhaps?" Hawthorne nodded, warming to the subject. "I've developed my own blends," he said. "Chemicals, nutrients, things you won't find in any shop. Gives my roses their edge." Miss Marple made a mental note. Unusual fertilizers could mean unusual compounds, and the alkaloid that killed Sir Henry was no common poison. As she rose to leave, thanking Hawthorne for his time, she noticed a smudge of soil on his sleeve, fresh and dark, as if he'd been tending his plants that morning. "Do take care, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her smile serene. "Ambition is a fine thing, but it can lead one into thorny places." He stared at her, his expression unreadable, and she felt the weight of his gaze as she stepped out into the fading light. Her next stop was the village hall, where Inspector Craddock was sifting through a stack of witness statements, his brow furrowed with frustration. The hall's air was thick with the scent of old wood and wax, a constable sorting evidence bags in the corner. Craddock looked up as Miss Marple entered, his face brightening slightly. "Miss Marple," he said, "you've been busy. Any insights on our friend Hawthorne?" She settled onto a chair, her handbag resting on her lap. "He's a man driven by ambition," she said, "and ambition can blind one to consequences. His fertilizers intrigue me. Could they include something more than nutrients?" Craddock nodded, flipping through his notebook. "We're searching his greenhouse tomorrow. If he's got anything like that alkaloid, we'll find it. But motive, he's got that in spades. Sir Henry's death clears the way for his roses to win, and that contract he mentioned is real. He's in debt, you know. Bad investments. A win could save him." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to itch for movement. "Debt is a powerful spur," she said, "and his gesture with the tea was so very convenient. But we must be sure, Inspector. A man like Hawthorne acts boldly, but poison requires subtlety." Craddock showed her a diagram of the judge's table, the teacup's position marked in red. "Hawthorne poured the tea here," he said, pointing. "Mrs. Price was nearby. Thorne was adjusting his display, and Miss Vance was watching from the side. Any of them could have slipped something into the cup." Miss Marple studied the diagram, her mind reconstructing the scene. "Hawthorne's action stands out," she said. "It was public, almost theatrical. A bold man might use boldness to hide cunning." As she left the hall, the village was settling into dusk, the lights of cottages glowing like fireflies. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts turning over Hawthorne's words and manner. His ambition was a fire, burning bright but dangerous. and his financial troubles added fuel. The fertilizers in his greenhouse were a lead worth pursuing, for the alkaloid was no ordinary poison. Yet she wondered if his bluster masked a deeper fear, not just of losing, but of being exposed. At her cottage, Mrs. Dolly Bantry was waiting, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Jane, you've been to see that Hawthorne brute," she said, settling onto the sofa with a cup of tea. "Is he the murderer?" Miss Marple's needles began their familiar rhythm, the click a counterpoint to her thoughts. "He's a man with much to gain, Dolly," she said. "His roses are his salvation, and Sir Henry was his obstacle. But ambition alone doesn't make a killer. We need evidence, and I suspect his greenhouse holds more than flowers." As the evening deepened, Miss Marple gazed out her window. The village now cloaked in shadow. Hawthorne's fire was undeniable, but fire could obscure as much as it revealed. The next piece of the puzzle lay with Miss Vance, whose quiet presence was like a shadow in a garden, unnoticed until it fell across the wrong flower. Miss Marple knew she must tread carefully, for the truth was taking root, and she was determined to see it bloom. Chapter 7. The Guest's Enigma. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a faint chill, as if the village itself shivered at the shadow cast by Sir Henry Clithering's murder. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl drawn close, walked toward the Black Swan Inn, where Miss Eleanor Vance, the enigmatic botanist, had taken up residence. The cobblestone path gleamed faintly under the rising moon, and Miss Marple's steps were steady, her mind as sharp as the stars overhead. Miss Vance, with her quiet watchfulness and elusive manner, was a puzzle within the larger mystery of the flower show, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover what lay beneath her reserved exterior. The Black Swan was a quaint establishment, its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows exuding a charm that belied the village's recent unrest. Inside, the parlor was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of polished oak and a faint trace of lavender. Miss Vance's perfume, perhaps. She sat alone by a corner window, her dark dress blending with the shadows, her small notebook open before her. Her pencil moved with deliberate precision, but her eyes lifted as Miss Marple entered, their gaze cool and assessing. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and measured. "I expected you might call." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a chair opposite, her black handbag resting on her lap like a faithful companion. "You're a keen observer, Miss Vance," she said, her tone gentle but probing. "I thought we might chat about the flower show. Your interest in botany must have made it quite an occasion." Miss Vance's lips curved faintly, though the smile did not reach her eyes. "A charming event," she replied, "though rather provincial for my tastes. I came to study local flora, hybridization techniques mostly." Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple noted the careful choice, as if each syllable had been weighed. The parlor was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the distant clink of glasses from the bar. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to Miss Vance's notebook, its pages filled with neat script and diagrams of plants. "You must have a wealth of knowledge," she said. "I understand you knew Sir Henry from a botanical conference." Miss Vance's fingers stilled on her pencil, a fleeting tension crossing her face. "Briefly," she said. "We met in London years ago. He was dismissive of my research on alkaloid properties in rare species, called it frivolous." Her voice held a trace of bitterness, quickly masked as she closed her notebook. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "It must sting to have one's work undervalued," she said, "especially by a man of Sir Henry's stature." Miss Vance's eyes narrowed, but she offered a shrug. "It was a minor slight, long forgotten. I came to St. Mary Mead for my studies, not to settle old scores." Yet Miss Marple caught the way her hand brushed against her bag, where a small vial, glimpsed briefly by the inn's maid, had been hidden. "Your studies," Miss Marple said, "do they involve plants with unusual properties?" Miss Vance's smile was thin. "All plants have properties, Miss Marple. Some heal, some harm. It's a matter of application." The answer was deft, but Miss Marple sensed a wall, carefully constructed. She shifted tack, her voice light. "You were near the judges' table during the show, I believe, observing the competition?" Miss Vance's posture stiffened. "I was studying the displays," she said. "The judges' activities were incidental." Yet Miss Marple recalled her lingering presence, her eyes fixed on Sir Henry as he sipped his tea. Incidental, perhaps, but deliberate. As they spoke, the inn's maid, a young woman named Clara, brought a tray of tea, her hands nervous as she set it down. Miss Marple thanked her, noting Clara's quick glance at Miss Vance's bag. When the maid retreated, Miss Marple leaned forward. "The village is full of talk," she said, "and some mention a vial you carry." "A botanist's tool, I'm sure?" Miss Vance's face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened on her bag. "A sample," she said curtly. "Extracts for my research, nothing more." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was racing. A vial, a botanist's expertise, and a grudge. Small pieces, but they fit the puzzle's edge. She rose to leave, her movements slow and deliberate. "You've been most kind, Miss Vance," she said. "I hope your studies prove fruitful." Miss Vance's nod was curt, her eyes following Miss Marple to the door. As she stepped into the cool night, Miss Marple felt the weight of that gaze, like a shadow trailing her steps. Miss Vance was a woman of secrets, her calm a veneer over something deeper. Resentment, perhaps, or a purpose yet unrevealed. Her next stop was the village hall, where Inspector Craddock was reviewing a report from the laboratory. The hall was quieter now, the constables' voices hushed as they sorted through evidence. Craddock looked up, his face etched with fatigue. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've checked Thorne's cabinet. No trace of the alkaloid, though his plant could produce it. Hawthorne's fertilizers are still being tested." He handed her a photograph of the judge's table, the teacup fragments stark against the white cloth. "Miss Vance is a mystery," he added. "No record of her in botanical circles under that name. She's using an alias, E. Vane." Miss Marple studied the photograph, her fingers tracing the table's edge. "An alias suggests caution," she said, "or concealment. Her knowledge of alkaloids is troubling, especially with that vial." Craddock nodded. "We're watching her, but motive, she's got no clear reason to kill Sir Henry beyond that old slight." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Motives, Inspector, are like roots, hidden until you dig. Miss Vance was watching Sir Henry closely. We must learn why." Back at her cottage, Mrs. Dolly Bantry was waiting, her curiosity as bright as the fire in the grate. "Jane, what's this about Miss Vance?" she asked, pouring tea. "Is she a poisoner in disguise?" Miss Marple's needles clicked, a steady rhythm against her thoughts. "She's a woman of shadows, Dolly," she said. "Her grudge against Sir Henry is old, but old wounds can fester. That vial, her notebook, they're clues, but not yet answers." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "And the poison? Could she have brought it from London?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, Perhaps, but I suspect the answer lies closer to home. We must look at the tea itself next, how it was poured, and by whom. As the night deepened, Miss Marple gazed out her window, the village cloaked in darkness. Miss Vance's enigma was a delicate thread in the tapestry of the crime, but threads could lead to knots. The next step, examining the tea's journey, would bring her closer to the truth, for in St. Mary Mead, even shadows had stories to tell. Chapter 8. The Teacup's Tale. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a clarity that seemed to mock the murky secrets surrounding Sir Henry Clithering's death. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and her knitting neatly folded beside her, gazed out at the village green, where the flower show's tents had been dismantled, leaving only trampled grass and lingering whispers. Her mind, however, was far from idle. Weaving together the threads of suspicion that tied Mr. Reginald Thorne, Mrs. Lavinia Price, Mr. Cedric Hawthorne, and Miss Eleanor Vance to the fatal teacup. The laboratory's report, delivered to Inspector Craddock late the previous evening, had confirmed the poison as a rare alkaloid, likely derived from a plant not native to England. This new piece of the puzzle sharpened Miss Marple's focus, and she resolved to revisit the scene of the crime, certain that the teacup held secrets yet untold. She made her way to the village hall, where Inspector Craddock had set up a temporary command post. The hall was quiet, its high windows letting in shafts of light that illuminated dust motes and the somber faces of the constables. Craddock stood by a table laden with evidence bags, his notebook open to a page of hurried scrawls. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, his voice weary but respectful. The labs confirmed the alkaloid, sourced from a South American plant, possibly the same as Thorne's, but his cabinet was clean, and we found no trace in Hawthorne's fertilizers. He gestured to a photograph of the shattered teacup, its delicate porcelain now a jigsaw of fragments. The poison was in the tea, no question, but how it got there, that's the rub. Miss Marple studied the photograph, her eyes tracing the cup's broken edges. "A teacup is such an intimate thing," she said softly. "Trusted, unnoticed. Whoever poisoned it knew Sir Henry's habits, his preference for tea, his place at the judge's table." Craddock nodded, pointing to a diagram of the tent's layout. "Thorne was adjusting his display here," he said, marking a spot near the table. "Mrs. Price was overseeing the service. Hawthorne poured the tea, and Miss Vance was lingering there." He tapped the diagram, his brow furrowed. "Any of them had the chance, but we need more than that." Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the show, picturing the judge's table with its white cloth and gleaming silver tea service. She recalled the bustle of the crowd, the competitors' anxious glances, and Hawthorne's bold gesture of pouring Sir Henry's tea. "Mr. Hawthorne's action was so public," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Almost as if he wanted to be seen." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think he was covering his tracks?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "I think, Inspector, that people often hide their cleverness in plain sight. We must consider how the poison reached the cup." She requested to see the tent site, now cleared but still cordoned off by police tape. Craddock obliged, and they walked to the green, where the grass bore faint scars from the tent's pegs. Miss Marple stood where the judge's table had been, closing her eyes to summon the scene. Sir Henry's confident voice, Mrs. Price's clipboard, Thorne's nervous adjustments, Miss Vance's watchful gaze, and Hawthorne's theatrical pour. "The tea was poured from the pot," she murmured, "but the poison could have been added earlier, or in the cup itself." Craddock frowned. "The pot was shared by the judges. No one else was affected." Miss Marple nodded. "Then the cup, or the tea within it, was tampered with specifically for Sir Henry." Back at the hall, she examined the evidence bags, her fingers hovering over the teacup fragments. "Was the cup washed before analysis?" she asked. Craddock shook his head. "Too broken, but we tested the residue. Pure alkaloid, no dilution." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Then it was added moments before he drank, precise, deliberate." She turned to Craddock. "Have you checked Miss Vance's vial? Her knowledge of alkaloids is extensive." Craddock sighed. "We're working on a warrant. She claims it's a research sample, but she's cagey about details." Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspect's access to the poison. Thorne's South American plant was a match, but his locked cabinet suggested caution, not guilt. Mrs. Price's tonic was harmless, and her oversight of the tea service, while thorough, left room for interference. Hawthorne's fertilizers were still under scrutiny, but his financial desperation and public gesture with the tea made him a focal point. Miss Vance, with her alias and botanical expertise, could have sourced the alkaloid abroad, her vial a potential clue. Yet motive remained the crux. Why target Sir Henry? And why now? She visited the village chemist, Mr. Polk, a talkative man with a penchant for gossip. His shop was a clutter of bottles and jars, the air sharp with the scent of herbs. "Miss Marple," he said, wiping his hands on his apron, "everyone's talking about the poison." "Nothing like that alkaloid's been through my shop, I swear." She nodded, her eyes scanning the shelves. "Could such a substance be distilled from a plant, Mr. Polk?" He scratched his chin. "With the right knowledge, aye, but you'd need a lab or a greenhouse like Thorne's, or maybe someone who's traveled far." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind circling back to Miss Vance's travels and Hawthorne's chemical blends. At her cottage, Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived, her face alight with questions. "Jane, have you cracked it? Was it the teacup?" Miss Marple's needles clicked, a soothing rhythm against her racing thoughts. "The teacup tells a story, Dolly," she said. "It was Sir Henry's alone, poisoned in a moment of opportunity. Hawthorne's pour was bold, but Miss Vance's presence was subtle, and subtlety can be deadly." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "And Thorne?" "Mrs. Price?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Each had their chance, but the motive is what binds them. We need to know who gained the most and who knew the poison best." As twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gazed out her window, the village now a patchwork of light and shadow. The teacup's tale was one of precision and betrayal, and the truth was closer than ever. The next step, unraveling the motives, would require her to dig deeper, for in the quiet of the village, secrets bloomed like flowers in the dark. Chapter 9. The Web of Motives. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was crisp, the village waking to a tentative calm that belied the undercurrent of unease following Sir Henry Clithering's murder. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly draped over her shoulders, sat in her cottage garden, her knitting needles idle as she sipped tea and reflected on the tapestry of clues woven thus far. The teacup, laced with a rare alkaloid, had pointed to a crime of precision, and the four suspects, Mr. Reginald Thorne, Mrs. Lavinia Price, Mr. Cedric Hawthorne, and Miss Eleanor Vance, each held a thread of motive and opportunity. Today, Miss Marple resolved to draw those threads together and she arranged a gathering at the village hall, ostensibly to discuss the flower show's continuation, but truly to observe the suspects in concert. The hall, still serving as Inspector Craddock's base, was abuzz with quiet activity, its high ceilings echoing the soft voices of constables sorting evidence. Miss Marple had persuaded Craddock to allow the meeting, suggesting that the suspects' interactions might reveal what individual interviews had not. "People betray themselves when they're together," she had told him, her eyes twinkling with the certainty of experience. Craddock, though skeptical, agreed, and by noon the hall was arranged with chairs in a semicircle, a table set with tea and biscuits to maintain the pretense of a community discussion. Mrs. Price arrived first, her clipboard clutched like a shield, her auburn hair pinned with meticulous care. Her smile was strained, her eyes darting as she surveyed the room, as if expecting judgment. Mr. Thorne followed, his tall frame stooped, his hands fidgeting with a handkerchief. He avoided eye contact, choosing a chair far from the table. Mr. Hawthorne strode in with his usual bravado, his florid face set in a grin that masked a flicker of unease. Miss Vance was last, her dark dress a stark contrast to the hall's brightness, her notebook tucked under her arm like a talisman. Miss Marple, seated near the back with her knitting bag, watched them settle, noting every glance, every shift in posture. Craddock opened the meeting, his tone formal but weary. "We're here to discuss the flower show's future," he said, "but I'll be blunt. Sir Henry's death hangs over us. Your cooperation is appreciated." The suspects nodded, their expressions a study in contrasts. Mrs. Price's forced calm, Thorne's nervous pallor, Hawthorne's defiant smirk, and Miss Vance's cool detachment. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm that anchored her observations as she watched the interplay. Mrs. Price spoke first, her voice clipped. "The show must go on," she said. "Sir Henry would have wanted it. I've already drafted a new schedule." Her eyes flicked to Miss Vance, who sat motionless, and Miss Marple noted the tension, as if Mrs. Price resented the botanist's presence. Thorne, prompted by Craddock, mumbled about his dahlias, his voice low. "They're ready for judging," he said, "but it feels wrong without Sir Henry." His glance at Hawthorne was sharp, almost accusing, and Miss Marple caught the rival's scowl in return. Hawthorne leaned back, his arms crossed. "My roses will take the prize," he said, his tone bold, but his eyes darting to Craddock. "Sir Henry's gone, but the competition's fair now." The words hung heavy, and Mrs. Price's lips tightened, as if his confidence grated. Miss Vance, silent until now, offered a quiet observation. "The show's integrity matters," she said, her voice soft but clear. Sir Henry's standards were exacting. Her gaze lingered on Hawthorne, who bristled, and Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent. Perhaps Miss Vance knew more of his ambitions than she let on. As the discussion turned to logistics, Miss Marple steered the conversation subtly, her questions gentle but pointed. "Mrs. Price," she said, "your oversight of the tea service was so thorough. Did you notice anything unusual that day?" Mrs. Price flushed, her fingers gripping her clipboard. "Nothing," she said. "I checked the pot myself. It was Hawthorne who poured the tea." Her tone held a hint of accusation, and Hawthorne's smirk faltered. "I was just being helpful," he snapped. "No crime in that." Miss Marple turned to Thorne. "Your dahlias were so close to the judge's table, Mr. Thorne. Did you see anyone tamper with the tea?" Thorne's hands twisted his handkerchief. "I was focused on my flowers," he said. "I didn't notice." Yet his eyes flicked to Miss Vance, who remained impassive. Miss Marple's needles paused as she addressed the botanist. "Miss Vance, your notebook must be full of observations. Did you note anything about the judge's table?" Miss Vance's smile was thin. "Only the flowers," she said. "I'm not one for tea." The room grew tense, the suspect's glances weaving a web of suspicion. Miss Marple observed how Thorne avoided Hawthorne, how Mrs. Price stiffened near Miss Vance, and how Hawthorne's bravado seemed to mask a growing unease. She recalled village gossip gleaned from the postmistress. Hawthorne's debts were mounting, his nursery contract his only hope. Thorne's old grudge against Sir Henry was known, but less pressing. Mrs. Price's resentment of Sir Henry's rules was clear, but bureaucratic. Miss Vance's slight from years ago felt distant, yet her botanical knowledge and that mysterious vial could not be ignored. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered with Craddock, who was scribbling notes. "They're circling each other like wolves," he said. "Hawthorne's got the strongest motive. Those debts are crushing him." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the diagram of the judge's table. "His gesture with the tea was bold," she said, "but boldness can hide cunning. Miss Vance's quietness troubles me. She sees more than she says." Craddock sighed. "We're testing her vial tomorrow. If it's the alkaloid, she's in trouble." Back at her cottage, Mrs. Dolly Bantry burst in, her eyes wide. "Jane, was it like a courtroom in there? Did they confess?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a counterpoint to her thoughts. "No confessions, Dolly," she said, "but motives are clearer now. Hawthorne's desperation is a fire, but Miss Vance's shadow is deeper. Thorne and Mrs. Price have their secrets, but I suspect the tea holds the answer." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "The tea? You think it's Hawthorne, don't you?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I think, Dolly, that the truth is like a web, tangled, but with a center. We're nearly there." As night fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gazed out her window, the village lights flickering like stars. The web of motives was tightening, and the next step, unraveling the poison's source, would bring her closer to the heart of the crime. The truth, she knew, was waiting to bloom, and she would find it, thread by careful thread. Chapter 10. The Final Bloom. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a serene glow, the village's quiet beauty, a stark contrast to the dark currents stirred by Sir Henry Clithering's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her cottage window with her morning tea, watched the first rays touch the rooftops, her mind weaving the final threads of the flower show mystery. The rare alkaloid in the teacup, the suspect's tangled motives, and the fleeting gestures at the judge's table had formed a pattern, and Miss Marple was certain. The truth lay with Mr. Cedric Hawthorne, whose ambition burned like a flame too fierce to be contained. Today, she resolved to share her deductions with Inspector Craddock and see the puzzle resolved. She arrived at the village hall by mid-morning, her black handbag clutched tightly, her shawl neat despite the brisk wind. The hall was a hive of activity, constables sorting reports as Craddock pored over a new laboratory analysis. He looked up, his face etched with the strain of the case. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've got something." A vial from Hawthorne's greenhouse, not Miss Vance's, tested positive for the alkaloid. It was hidden in a fertilizer tin, unmarked. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. "Hidden in plain sight," she said softly. "A bold choice for a bold man." Craddock spread out a diagram of the judge's table, the teacup's position marked in red. "Hawthorne poured Sir Henry's tea," he said, "but we need to prove he added the poison. Motive's clear, his debts that nursery contract, but evidence is thin." Miss Marple nodded, her mind revisiting the show. Hawthorne's theatrical gesture, Mrs. Price's frown, Thorne's nervous glances, and Miss Vance's watchful stillness. "Mr. Hawthorne's ambition was his undoing," she said. "He knew Sir Henry's scrutiny would cost him the prize, so he acted boldly, but not without cunning." She shared her theory, her voice calm but precise. "The poison was added to the teacup, not the pot, for only Sir Henry was affected. Mr. Hawthorne's offer to pour was no act of kindness. It was his moment. He prepared the cup beforehand, perhaps coating it with the alkaloid, then swapped it under the guise of courtesy. His debts, Inspector, were a noose tightening around him. The nursery contract was his salvation, and Sir Henry's death ensured a less discerning judge." Craddock's brow furrowed. "The vial's damning, but we need a witness or a confession." Miss Marple suggested a confrontation, inviting the suspects to the hall under the pretext of a final inquiry. By noon, they were gathered. Mrs. Price, her clipboard abandoned but her posture rigid. Mr. Thorne, pale and fidgeting. Miss Vance, cool and detached. And Hawthorne, his bravado fraying, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. Craddock took the lead, his tone firm. "We've found the poison," he said, holding up the vial in an evidence bag. "From Mr. Hawthorne's greenhouse. Care to explain?" Hawthorne's face reddened, his hands clenching. "That's not mine," he blustered. "Anyone could have planted it." But his voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow. She spoke gently, her words cutting. "You were desperate, Mr. Hawthorne. Sir Henry's judgment stood between you and ruin. You poured his tea, a bold move to hide a subtle crime." Mrs. Price gasped, Thorne's eyes widened, and Miss Vance's gaze sharpened, but Hawthorne's defiance crumbled. "I just wanted to win," he muttered, his shoulders slumping. "I studied the alkaloid, thought it'd be untraceable. I didn't mean for it to go this far." The confession hung in the air, a bitter bloom. Craddock signaled a constable, who led Hawthorne away, his bravado reduced to silence. Mrs. Price clutched her hands, relief mingling with shock. Thorne shook his head, as if waking from a dream. Miss Vance slipped out quietly, her role in the drama peripheral but unresolved. Miss Marple watched them go, her heart heavy for Sir Henry, but lightened by the truth's emergence. At her cottage, Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived, her eyes wide. "Jane, you did it. Hawthorne, of all people." Miss Marple's needles clicked, a steady rhythm. "Ambition, Dolly," she said, "can twist even a good heart. Mr. Hawthorne's roses were his pride, but pride led him to poison." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "And the others? Were they innocent?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Innocent of murder, perhaps, but not of secrets. Every garden has its weeds." As evening fell, Miss Marple gazed out her window, the village settling into peace. The final bloom of truth had opened, but its roots ran deep, touching the ambitions and fears of all involved. She sipped her tea, her mind already turning to the next mystery. For in St. Mary Mead, secrets never stayed buried long. Chapter 11. The show goes on. The sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a gentle warmth, as if to soothe the village after the storm of Sir Henry Clithering's murder. The green, scarred from the flower show's tents, was beginning to recover, blades of grass reaching upward in quiet defiance. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her garden with a shawl over her shoulders, observed the village's slow return to normalcy. Her knitting lay untouched, her thoughts lingering on Cedric Hawthorne's confession, a bitter resolution to a crime that had shaken the community. Yet life, she knew, was like a garden, resilient, ever pushing toward renewal. Today, the flower show would resume, a testament to that endurance, and Miss Marple intended to watch its final act. The village hall, no longer a police outpost, had been transformed back into a venue of celebration. Bunting was restrung, tables reset with fresh linens, and the air hummed with cautious optimism. Inspector Craddock, his duties now focused on paperwork, had agreed to let the show continue under new judges, a decision Mrs. Lavinia Price had seized with fervor. Miss Marple arrived early, her black handbag a familiar weight, and took a seat near the main tent's entrance, where she could observe the crowd and the remaining players in this drama. Mrs. Price was already there, her auburn hair pinned with precision, her clipboard restored to its role as her scepter. Yet her movements, though brisk, lacked their former rigidity, as if Hawthorne's arrest had lifted a burden. She greeted villagers with a smile that, while not warm, was genuine, and Miss Marple noted her determination to salvage the show's reputation. "Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, approaching her, "you've worked wonders to bring this back to life." Mrs. Price's eyes softened. "It's for Sir Henry," she said. "He loved this event. We must honor him." The words carried a sincerity that eased Miss Marple's earlier suspicions, though she wondered if Mrs. Price's need for control still hid private struggles. Mr. Reginald Thorne stood by his dahlias, their crimson and gold petals a quiet triumph. His tall frame was less stooped, but his face bore the weight of recent days. Miss Marple approached, her smile gentle. "Your flowers are as splendid as ever, Mr. Thorne," she said. He nodded, his eyes distant. "It's not the same without Sir Henry," he said. "Winning feels hollow." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You've earned it, though. Your passion shines through." Thorne's lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through, but Miss Marple saw no trace of the nervous defensiveness that had marked him before. His secrets, it seemed, were those of a man devoted to his craft, not to murder. Miss Eleanor Vance was absent, her departure from the village noted by the inn's maid. "Left at dawn," Clara had whispered to Miss Marple earlier, with her notebook and that vial of hers. Miss Marple pondered this, her mind circling back to the botanist's enigmatic presence. Miss Vance's grudge against Sir Henry had been real but distant, and her role in the crime, if any, was peripheral. Yet her alias and quiet exit left a question mark, a shadow that might linger in Miss Marple's thoughts long after the show ended. The new judges, a retired botanist from Oxford and a local nursery owner, moved through the displays with careful deliberation. The crowd, smaller than before, watched with subdued anticipation, their chatter tinged with references to the tragedy. When the awards were announced, Thorne's dahlias took the top prize, a decision met with polite applause. He accepted the ribbon with a nod, his expression somber rather than triumphant. Mrs. Price, overseeing the ceremony, declared the show a success, her voice steady, but her eyes glistening as she mentioned Sir Henry's memory. Miss Marple lingered after the ceremony, her eyes scanning the green. The show had gone on, as life always did, but the cost was etched in the faces around her. She thought of Hawthorne, now in custody, his ambition a flame that had consumed him. A pity, she murmured to herself, that such passion turned to poison. Mrs. Dolly Bantry joined her, her hat slightly askew from the day's excitement. "Jane, it's over at last," she said, "but it feels so strange without Sir Henry." Miss Marple nodded, her smile wistful. "Life persists, Dolly, but it leaves scars. We honor him by seeking truth." As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple walked home, the village settling into evening's embrace. The show had closed, but its lessons lingered. Ambition, pride, and secrets could bloom as fiercely as any flower. She knew St. Mary Mead would face other mysteries, and she would be ready, her quiet wisdom a light in the village's shadows. Chapter 12. A Quiet Reflection. The twilight settled over St. Mary Mead with a soft hush, the village's cottages glowing like embers against the deepening sky. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, a cup of tea steaming on the table beside her, her knitting needles resting quietly in their basket. The midsummer flower show had closed, its ribbons awarded and its tents folded away, but the echo of Sir Henry Clithering's murder lingered in her thoughts. The truth had bloomed at last. Cedric Hawthorne's desperate ambition had led to poison, but the resolution brought Miss Marple no triumph, only a quiet sorrow for a friend lost and a village shaken. Her window framed the familiar outlines of St. Mary Mead, and she reflected on the human frailties that had turned a celebration of beauty into a stage for tragedy. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and Miss Marple's mind wandered over the case's intricate threads. Reginald Thorne, with his dahlias and wounded pride, had emerged as a man more devoted to his blooms than to vengeance. His locked cabinet, once a source of suspicion, held only the tools of his craft, and his victory at the show, though bitter-sweet, was a testament to his resilience. Mrs. Lavinia Price, her need for control stretched to breaking, had proven innocent of murder, her strain born of duty rather than malice. Her efforts to revive the show honored Sir Henry's memory, though Miss Marple suspected she would carry the weight of the event's shadow for years to come. Miss Eleanor Vance remained an enigma, her quiet departure leaving unanswered questions. Her botanical knowledge and that mysterious vial had hinted at danger, but her motive, a slight from a distant conference, lacked the immediacy to drive her to murder. Miss Marple wondered if Miss Vance's alias and sudden exit hid other secrets, perhaps unrelated to Sir Henry, but no less intriguing. In a village like St. Mary Mead, she knew, some mysteries remained half-buried, waiting for another season to sprout. Cedric Hawthorne, now in custody, was the heart of the tragedy. His ambition, fueled by debts and dreams of a nursery contract, had twisted into a desperate act. Miss Marple recalled his bold gesture with the teacup, a moment of theatrical courtesy that masked a calculated crime. The alkaloid, hidden in his greenhouse, was his undoing, a secret betrayed by his own need to win. She felt no satisfaction in his fall, only a pang for the man he might have been, had pride not led him astray. Mrs. Dolly Bantry burst into the room, her cheeks flushed from the evening chill. "Jane, you're a marvel," she exclaimed, settling onto the sofa with a rustle of skirts. "Hawthorne caught, the show saved. How do you do it?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes distant. "I only watch, Dolly," she said, "and listen. People are like gardens, beautiful but prone to weeds. Sir Henry's death showed us that." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her curiosity undimmed. "But what now? Will the village ever be the same?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, the warmth steadying her. "It will heal," she said, "as villages do. But we'll remember Sir Henry, and the lesson that ambition can be as deadly as any poison." Her gaze drifted to the window, where the village lights twinkled like stars. St. Mary Mead was quiet now, its secrets laid bare, but Miss Marple knew others would take root. Her needles waited in their basket, ready for the next tangle, for in this small corner of the world, human nature was an endless bloom, ever ready to surprise.